Hey everyone, welcome to my Thursday Lunch and Learn series. I'm Joanne Hughes. I'm a multi-dimensional holistic coach and practitioner. Today we're talking about ancestral lineage and learning to break free. So, first I'll talk about and just show you ways that we can see the simplest, the most basic ways that ancestral lineage affects us. So we can see that in our traits. So, for instance, the way we look, because our parents would look like their parents and like our grandparents. And so our physical appearance would be the simplest way to show you how ancestral lineage can affect us. So in our physical appearance, our eye color, our hair color. um, Also, another way could be that, if our grandparents, for instance, or our parents weren't able to digest proteins, were sensitive to the sun, if their eyes were sensitive to the sun, maybe they were prone to ear infections. All of these genetic traits are passed down through our DNA. Okay, so as well, if we're going to talk about ancestral lineage, we need to first talk about trauma. So, what is trauma? Trauma is an emotional reaction to a distressing event. And so, the reaction to that distressing event can manifest immediately through shock or denial. We see it down the road in strained relationships or immediately in physical symptoms. So there's a lot of research that suggests that the effects of trauma extend beyond that initial event, and it can be passed down and transmitted to generations. And so there's a lot of scientific research out there that you can get online, and I will put on the link to this video some of the resources where I found information on this. So there is converging evidence supporting the idea that our offspring are affected by parental trauma exposure occurring before their birth, the child's birth, and even possibly prior to their conception. And so traumatic experiences will influence the expression of our genes and thereby affecting our offspring. So trauma never alters our DNA, but it guides it guides which genes will be activated or deactivated. And if we're going to talk about trauma and genes, we have to mention epigenetics. Epigenetics is a scientific field that investigates how our environment influences our genes, altering not our DNA, but how it's read and utilized. And so I just want to talk for a moment about my experiences and how I've witnessed firsthand generational trauma and ancestral lineage. So I was for years a counselor, for 20 plus years, a counselor in the field of domestic violence. And so when I was working at women's shelters, and in particularly, I was at one shelter for 17 years. And in that time, I was able to witness the mom coming in with her children. And I was there long enough to see her children now coming in with their children. So that's another way that we see how ancestral lineage and that generational trauma affects our offspring. And then we also have to kind of touch base on secondary trauma, because secondary trauma is when we would see that in first responders, emergency workers. So, for instance, a police officer attends a scene where there was just a homicide. So, that police officer now can be traumatized or have an experience of trauma through that event. And then if that officer goes home and, just the way he is experiencing that event, whether it's being withdrawn, um, maybe becoming depressed or turning to, you know, addictions, turning to a substance, alcohol or drugs, and how he is expressing that through his emotions at home, the family can also experience that secondary trauma. And, really we can see ancestral lineage and intergenerational trauma through indigenous cultures. So if we look at our First Nations culture, that they experience intergenerational trauma through the genocides, the continual genocide of their culture, of their addictions, and all the traumas that they've experienced. Where, again, working in shelters, I was able to witness that firsthand and seeing how it not only affects the parents and even the grandparents, but how it affects their children. And when those children become adults and have their children, you see the same responses and the same traumas over and over again in their culture. And so for myself, I was adopted, and 2 years ago I found my biological family. And I'll talk a little bit about how what I learned about my own lineage. So I grew up in a home where my parents never argued or raised their voice. They never fought a day in their life, yet I experienced domestic violence and relationships that became abusive over and over again. And what I learned was that my biological mother also experienced abusive relationships over and over again. And so, and also she experienced a lot of trauma around her adoption, as my biological mother was adopted as well. So in that situation, you can see how ancestral lineage affects us. Now, if we look back at how, well, I'm going to get into this a little bit further here, I guess. So let's continue before I get ahead of myself. So I just want to talk about genomic imprinting. So I'll just get my notes for that. Oops. So there is what's called genomic imprinting, and it researches how thoughts, emotions, and behaviors of our parents cast the first genetic die. So, for instance, our parents possibly were experiencing fear. So, if I look at myself and my mother, in her situation, she was experiencing poverty and probably experiencing fear. So, that fear then, that genetic material then gets imprinted into the egg and the sperm, for the offspring. And the reason why that happens, for this genetic material to be imprinted, so that's depending, like we're talking days and months before even conception, is that fear gets, let's say it's fear that gets imprinted into the egg and sperm for the offspring. Then if they're going to experience the same environment, it's for the survival of that offspring to be able to survive the conditions, the environmental conditions that the parents were experiencing. So, cross-linking is the exchange of genetic materials. So, if we look at 23 chromosomes that are given by the male and 23 chromosomes given to the female, so 46 chromosomes make the human being. So it's also been studied and researched that the blood flowing from the female, that blood flow from the female when the child is in the womb, is directly and constantly in communication with the child. So when you think about that, that's her thoughts and feelings and her actions, her view of the outside world, then further influence the development of the fetus. So if the child is born in a stressful survival situation and the animal nature of the brain then is activated, many times studies show that the child would then be born with a smaller circumference of the head, a smaller forebrain, and a larger a larger hindbrain and larger adrenal glands. And that's because the signal emotionally that the mother is experiencing is molding the child to survive if the child is experiencing the environment that the parents are perceiving. And so now, if we look at the father, and the father's the provider and the protector, if the father is abusive, now that is also um, out of balance if he's abusive. So that's a little bit about genomic imprinting. So I just wanted to first quickly talk about the Empower 360s, which is my 6-week group coaching program that's starting March 4th. And in that, I talk about the 5 keys that influence the direction of our lives. And so it's environment or circumstance, our thought, emotion, action, and outcome. And all of these things um, are ways that are going to influence the direction of our lives. So when we're talking about genomic imprinting, epigenetics, all of that, that's the explanation of how ancestral lineage gets passed down from generation to generation. And so now, if we look at as well in the workshop, I go over the 5 pillars to transformation. That's what I call them. And so this is how we can stop ancestral lineage. Is the 5 pillars that I talk about are acceptance. So being able to, for one thing, accept where we are in our life right now. Because if we're fighting with that, if we are hard on ourselves, if we have negative feelings around that, that's continuing to perpetuate that trauma. So acceptance is about just accepting where we are right now on our path. And then the next pillar is inquiry. So really, if we're going to change and break free from our ancestral lineage, we have to become the spy to our thoughts. And really, that's the key. So, when we have a thought, we have to do an inquiry around that. So really, when I have a client, what I tell them is that for a week that they are observing their thoughts. And if you're observing your thoughts, you have to be really present and really aware, because if you're not aware and you're not present, you're not going to be able to catch those thoughts. So inquiry. So when those thoughts come up, what I do is I ask my clients just to write down their thoughts that they find that are coming up, because we have so many thousands of thoughts in a day in our mind, and most of those thoughts are at an unconscious level. And so really, not even being aware of those thoughts that are coming in because they're unconscious, what happens is those thoughts that we have will always trigger an emotion. And so being aware and looking into the thoughts that we have, and those thoughts that we have are probably the same thoughts that we had yesterday or the day before. And so really starting to, when we feel that emotion in our body, which is the first thing that you're going to feel, is just an emotion. So whatever your state is, whatever your emotions are when you're going through the day, and what you find that you feel most days, then when you stop and you look at your thought, now you're inquiring about that thought. And so I would tell my clients to write this down. So, when after we're looking at those thoughts, and after a week of really observing and, like I say, spying on our thoughts, now you have that awareness. Now you've brought focus on that. And really, now what you have to start to do is start to prime the brain and the body, because priming the brain and the body is about now switching those thoughts. So if you notice that every day, for instance, your thought is, um, maybe you have a thought that, life sucks. Let's just take that thought. So if you have that thought and you notice through the inquiry that that's a thought that you consistently think of, now you need to switch that thought, because now you see, oh, this is a thought. And is that thought really true? Is it true that your life sucks? No, you're going to find that your life doesn't suck. That maybe there's ups and downs that we all experience and we go through, but really that thought that you have isn't true. And so now we're going to replace that with a different thought. And there's a practice of how we begin to rewire those thoughts. So we begin to practice this. So in the 6-week group coaching program that I have, what that is every day going through a visualization and a meditation, but more it's the visualization, because when we visualize ourself um, switching something, a trait or a thought, or um, just our state or mood, when we see ourselves switching that and we're visualizing that every day, our brain begins to rewire itself, because, brain cells that wire together fire together. And so those brain cells are starting to now change. And so through visualization, constant visualization, it's just like, professional athletes do this as well, where, and studies have also been done with this, is that I believe I mentioned it in one of my videos on my channel, but if you have a bodybuilder, and you have bodybuilders, and one bodybuilder can't go to the gym and lift weights. He can only visualize himself lifting weights for a week. And then there's a bodybuilder that can go to the gym. The bodybuilder that didn't go to the gym but was visualizing himself lifting those weights, it was it was proven and studied that that bodybuilder gained muscle mass just as much as the bodybuilder that actually went to the gym. So we know that this practice really helps to rewire the brain. And then the fifth pillar is then the implementation. And so, okay, let's look at, really, I talk about this as well with my group Evolve. And Evolve is an acronym for energy, vibration, observation, love, visualization, and epigenetics. And so when we want to end ancestral lineage, we want to utilize the 5 keys I spoke about and the 5 pillars. But then we also have to focus on the muscles, the body, the energy centers of the body, the chakras, because we know that our body holds stress and our body and cells hold trauma. And so we need to work with the energy of the body, the chakras, because they also that attributes to illness and disease. Utilizing observation, which is the inquiry, the visualization. We activate those energy centers and talk about epigenetics and neuroplasticity and implementation of the new you. Because we do know that if we want to change our behavior, we literally have to change our personality. And again, when we look at ancestral lineage, because this stuff is passed down from generation to generation, with the genetic material being passed through genes, through our offspring, the state of our parents. All of this stuff contributes to trauma and ancestral trauma. And so I also want to just talk for a few minutes about Dr. Bruce Lipton. If you haven't heard of him, you can look into him. He wrote a book called the Biology of Belief. And so his research taught him that cells have an intelligence and live in cooperative communities, working together in response to the signals they get from their environment. And so he also studied how our environment and thoughts influence our cells. And he states that cell behavior is a mirror to human behavior. So really, that really shows us how important it is for us to begin to observe our thoughts, because our environment, let's just go back to the 5 keys here. So our environment is is where we live, the circumstances in our life. So it can be where you live, your financial stability, your spouse, your partner, or lack of, our children. All of this stuff plays a part in our environment, and that affects us. I guess the simplest way to look at that as well is, let's say you're in a marriage and your partner and you, your spouse, the night before had an argument, and then you wake up the next day and you still have that energy of that argument. You still might be upset. Maybe you're not talking to them. Maybe you're thinking about the conversation that you had. And so those thoughts from that fight are still active. And, for a lot of people, they tend to hold on to those thoughts, to those emotions, and to that event. And so then that's why it's so important to observe our thoughts and spy on our thoughts, because our thoughts will influence our cells, right? If you think of energy, our body's made up of energy, and our thoughts are energy, and those thoughts, permeate the energy of our body. And if some of you, or if you've ever read the book Messages from Water, that's another book to look into, where how our thoughts influence water crystals. That was a study done. And our body is made up of mostly water. So when we're looking at that book and that study that was done there as well, we can then think about how our thoughts can affect our body. I'm also a huge Dr. Joe Dispenza fan, and in listening to, a lot of his talks, he always talks about how our thoughts make us sick. And you can actually see many people, many thought leaders, many researchers and studies that talk about how our thoughts make us sick. So that's why all of the 5 keys is really important and influence the direction of our life. Okay, so let me just go here. So, again, hopefully, the first part of explaining ancestral lineage, how we can find that in our lifetime, if we or how we can find that in our personality trait, in our physical traits, and how we can see that in different cultures. Also, if we look up our DNA and our ancestry, we can see traits that have been passed down through our DNA. And so, really, the observing part is really, really huge as well. If you look at, just even do some self inquiry and self reflecting on, looking at your life, looking at your parents, looking at, going back to when you were a child and really looking at, how your parents interacted with each other, how they interacted with you. What were some of the values that were talked about, some of the beliefs, and how did you take those on, those beliefs or values that were passed down from your grandparents or your parents and then on to you? We can really look at all of that and just begin to, write down some of the ways that we see that intergenerational trauma affecting us. Um, if you're looking at a parent that, maybe your ancestors were in the Holocaust and, those your great grandparents talked about that with your grandparents, and then your grandparents talked to your parents about that, you're going to see that in the behaviors of your parents and just how your parents react and act in everyday life. And so then really going back and looking at again your life and self-reflecting, in my family, when there's a get together, everyone gets together. We played baseball and games, but everyone smoked cigarettes, and that was just a part of what it was to get together in a family gathering. And so maybe at a family gathering, everyone is arguing, or your family's really loud, or they talk with their hands. You can see how that those traits are passed down and how they affect you. And so, just really doing some reflection around that. And really, how you stop that is by just making that decision and, making the decision like, um, if you go back to ancient civilizations and cultures, some cultures before the husband and before couples marry, so they get married and they're kept apart. That's not so that that's not so that they don't have intercourse or have intimacy, share that. They were kept apart because they wanted to bring the best of their self to um, to their children. Excuse me, to their children. And so, um, really looking at how they could make the environment the best environment to procreate. That's what happened in other cultures. And so really making that commitment that, yeah, I'm going to do the self reflection. I'm going to start to look at, like I say, the 5 keys and the 5 pillars, and looking into um, how you are and the person that you want to become. And then when you think about that and we talk about that, we can't talk about that without mentioning the quantum field, because we can access the quantum realm through accessing a state of our brain. So, you know, going through beta, delta, theta, and gamma. When we can access those different brain states or those brain waves, We're accessing the quantum. Now, as well, I talk about my 5-minute method, which goes through being able to access those different brain waves. So I will post a video about the 5-minute method, or post the link to my YouTube channel below as well, because I've probably already done a video on the 5-minute method. So we want to be able to access, when we're talking about changing and stopping ancestral lineage, we do go through the work and do that inquiry and look into our thoughts and our emotions and all of that stuff. But then when we do the self-reflection, we start to look at who we want to be. So now we're looking at our future self. And so what is your future self going to look like? Is your future self in the past? Well, no, when you want to make that change, you want to look at your future self in the future. So then you just start to, again, it's that practice, it's that rewiring of the brain to become your future self. Now you're accessing the quantum realm. So I just, so hopefully that helps. And if you have any questions, just post it in the comments section below. I wanted to do it this way because that way I could end recording and re-record if I had interruptions and stuff like that. So I just want to quickly talk about the 6-week group coaching program that's coming up, which is called Empower 360. It begins March 4th. I will meet 3 times weekly on StreamYard. And with that program, you get unlimited coaching as well through Telegram. So you have access to answer or ask me any questions. If you need to request a private session with me through that 6-week time, you can do so. Request that through Telegram, and then we will meet and set up a time to do an extra session. Also, with group coaching, being in a group with like-minded people that are on the same path and journey is really powerful, because, you may not always think about the questions that you want to ask, or the things even to think about, things that you want to change, or things that come up as challenges for you. We may forget those things in the moment, but when we're in a group, we listen to the stories and the challenges of the other members. And that way, that helps inspire us and helps trigger our emotions and thoughts that we might have forgot about. Also, we do clearings in in the 6-week coaching program. So I'm a soul realignment practitioner as well. So I go into the Akashic records and do any clearings of any programs that we have. So again, we could look at past lives. We can look at ancestral lineage on how, our blocks around money, our thought patterns, beliefs, all of that stuff can affect us. So I go into the soul record and do clearings. The clearings we do on our chakras, the activation. I also utilize cognitive behavior therapy in that. And so the advantages are, for the coaching for the 6 weeks, will build routine, help you create that routine, primes your body, primes your brain for that change for that change to occur at the end of 6 weeks. So that's really, really powerful. So it's online. It's at an introductory price right now at $444. But after the 6 weeks, it will go up to $1,111. And also, literally, you have access to 24/7 support for 6 weeks of the program. So thank you so much for joining me at this Lunch and Learn series. And if you have any questions,